Hi everyone, welcome to the Cyber Talks podcast presented by eSentire. Today we have Spence joining us. Spence is a staff threat intelligence researcher within our threat response unit, or TRU, and we're going to be chatting about his background, his thoughts on the ransomware landscape, and we'll also have the chance to dive into the 2024 SMB ransomware report that we published this past January. It's going to be a great conversation today, so let's get started. Spence, welcome, and thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Rob. Good to be here.
Awesome. All right, so I wanted to start at the beginning. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your role here at eSentire?
Yep, so I'm a staff researcher on the threat intelligence team at eSentire. Our job is really to sort of sit at the intersection of, the some of the casework and incidents that our SOC team handles and the broader threat landscape, and look for those intersections and really identify gaps in our capabilities and ensure that those are addressed through new detection content, written threat intelligence products, threat hunts, et cetera, and ensuring that really the product and service that we provide to our customers is the best that it could be.
Nice. And I know you started in the SOC and then transitioned to the TRU team. Are you able to explain how that happened?
Really got my first role was in the Security Operations Center quite a few years ago now, when really it was a really network-centric position where we were looking at a lot of network signals. As the cybersecurity business evolved and we started to see more EDR technology, endpoint, log, etc., I ended up moving into more of a training role. And it was within that training role that it was addressing some of those new technologies that I then made the transition over to threat intelligence and really just took those some of that methodology and just applied it in more of a threat-centric view. Because at the end of the day, in my opinion, threat intelligence, a lot of it is understanding complex issues and distilling that down for the appropriate audience.
All right. Well, thanks for that. So, with ransomware evolving quite a bit in the past few years, can you walk us through the evolution of ransomware attacks from simple smash and grab strategies to more sophisticated network-wide dominations? What's driven this evolution?
Yeah, so if we go back to like the early to mid 2010s, we really saw sort of just these opportunistic ransomware like CryptoLocker, CryptoWall, where the goal was to lock down a single machine and extract payment from that single victim. And I think the average extortion demand back then was around $500 per machine, but they were still able to make quite a bit of money off that type of scheme. I think they made in the millions of dollars off of that. Fortunately, security teams and technology got better after a few years at mitigating those attacks, so they eventually fell off. Now, if we look at in the last 6 to 7 years, we really saw this new method of extortion attacks really take off, where the focus was complete, like you said, domination of networks, and then using that privileged access or that sort of stranglehold on networks to lock out systems, steal data, etc. This really enabled threat actors to disable security controls, destroy backups, and really force victims into paying their ransom, basically leaving them with no other choice. Now, this started to take off around 2018 with groups like Ryuk and Maze. Now, ultimately, this does take more effort, but can yield much bigger payouts from victims. Now, once this style of extortion attack did show promise, we started to see this sort of criminal gig economy, if you want to call it, emerge on the underground, which I'll use interchangeably with dark web, to support the demand for network access and defense evasion techniques. So, for example, we saw traditional banking malware groups completely change their objectives from fraud to just simply delivering footholds to ransomware groups because there was less risk and ultimately more money for them to be made.
Wow. Okay. If we dove a little deeper into the attack flow a little bit more, Could you explain how recovery time and costs get impacted as you progress down that flow?
Yeah, ultimately, the higher the degree of access a threat actor has, the more difficult it will be to kick them out. In a couple of ways. Number one, if they have privileged access, they can disable your defenses, they can destroy backups, they can remove those lifelines for an organization to, counter and ultimately push back that attack. They can also establish persistence mechanisms in the way of malware or backup accounts, things that will make it, at first pass, you may think you've removed the adversary, when in fact they may still have a backdoor account somewhere that they can use to reinitiate their attack. You know, doing this, eh, the as the scope of the attack changes, so does your response efforts and ultimately cost. If you compare like a single machine and maybe an account that's been compromised, it's fairly routine to go and isolate that and reset credentials, etc. Versus an attacker with domain admin access who has a stranglehold in the network. You may need to bring in IR teams or conduct a pretty thorough investigation, which is going to ultimately turn out to be pretty costly.
So, getting into this SMB ransomware readiness report, we talk about the criminal gig economy enabling these ransomware attacks. Specifically, we've seen so many ransomware as a service groups pop up. So, can you tell me about how these groups operate and how they infiltrate networks?
I would argue a major portion of underground services are fueled by extortion attacks, ransomware attacks. So that includes like malware services, initial access brokers, credential markets, malware obfuscation or cryptors, etc. Then there's the ransomware as a service model itself. So these groups or these services, they take care of all of the overhead that comes with extortion attacks, stuff like negotiating ransoms and laundering payments, and really just require that an attacker follow their playbook to deploy encryption software and steal data. And that ultimately lowers the skill barrier for adversaries and creates demand for network footholds. So, for example, let's say, I'm an attacker or I'm a bad actor looking to run an extortion attack. I have so many choices for getting my foot in the door somewhere. I can go to places like Russian Market and I can search for credentials or authentication cookies to a enterprise or corporate VPN. I can buy that for as little as $10. I can even buy root access to a company from a initial access broker for a couple of grand and then extort them for many times that amount.
Wow. So I know the report also discusses the outside in approach to ransomware exposure. How does this approach help in understanding the threats posed by the dark web?
Yeah, so in my opinion, most ransomware attacks start off as opportunistic, like a single employee getting their credentials phished or infecting themselves with malware. In many cases, that data or access will need to be bought or brought to market where it can be sold. Now, having visibility into that market can help you compromise before identify that compromise before it's actioned or weaponized. And think of this visibility as an added layer to your security stack, especially when it comes to unmanaged devices. So I think devices or systems outside of our monitoring scope that still have access to our network through things like IM applications or VPN credentials. I think those are somewhat underreported in terms of the risk. And that's starting to come more into light now. If you look at, I think Microsoft put out a stat in their 2023 threat report that some 80 to 90% of the intrusions that they saw stemmed from unmanaged devices. And as defenders, we may not see the impact of those unmanaged devices until the attacker is inside the network. So really having that visibility or extending your visibility beyond your network edge into places like underground forums and markets can give you an early or the potential for an early warning sign of impending attack.
Gotcha. Okay. So if we're going to get into the meat of the report a little bit more, are you able to break down which industries and types of businesses are most at risk for ransomware attacks? And if there's any particular segments that are targeted a little bit more.
Yeah, so the top 5 industries that we identified in descending order are manufacturing, business services, retail, construction, and education. Now, overwhelmingly, we found that small to medium-sized businesses were most affected, and that's across the board, across all of those industry segments. If we look at modern ransomware attacks, they require, countering those or mitigating those, or I should say reducing the risk. It requires defending against multiple fronts where attackers that can phish credentials, they can exploit something, they can infect a device, or they can even just buy their way in, as we talked about in the report. And defending against a successful intrusion requires the right tools and expertise, and two things that are significant investments for every organization. I think it's plausible that SMBs simply don't have the in-house resources to, patch every hole and react quickly enough to attackers within their network. And unfortunately, as we've kind of touched on, once an attacker has that foothold, it can be very difficult to kick them out, especially if they've obtained privilege access within the network.
Interesting. Okay. And as it relates to initial access brokers, or IABs, we know that they play a crucial role in the ransomware economy. But we'd love to get a little more from you on if you believe that most security teams are aware of those brokers, and I guess who they are and what they're really capable of.
Yeah, I mean, think of these guys as really just specialists when it comes to uh, gaining access into a network and monetizing that access. They're oftentimes using known exploits. They may be phishing credentials. They may be, abusing or exploiting a hole in your network that oftentimes is completely avoidable. Now, in terms of countering this, the obvious answer is, preventing your network from being auctioned off in the first place. I think the real answer here is a combination of preventative measures and continuous monitoring. The auction process where they're taking a foothold within your network and selling that to the highest bidder on places like Exploit Forum, that process isn't immediate. There's a delay there, and that gives you opportunity to identify an intrusion and then kick out that adversary before the keys change hands to someone who's looking to do, run an extortion play or something else. Now, in some cases, you can identify access auctions for your organization on the underground. We have seen this, but oftentimes, these access brokers are getting wise to this. They know that intel companies are out there monitoring these forums, and many times they don't offer much in terms of identifying information, but it's still very much worth looking for those identifiers.
Definitely. All right. So another piece on this is, as you know, there's a noted correlation between credential exposure on the dark web and ransomware victims. Are you able to elaborate on how these compromised credentials are used in ransomware attacks?
Yeah, so stolen credentials come primarily from phishing and malware. I think the biggest risk today is our credentials coming from information stealing malware. Um, info stealer, typically they will, if you can infect it with one, it'll siphon off all the credentials, most of the credentials on your machine that it can get access to. So this includes like stored credentials in your browser. It can also steal authentication cookies. So they can actually impersonate a live or ongoing session and hijack that and circumvent things like MFA. Now, how would a ransomware actor use this? It's pretty straightforward. There are places called, info stealer markets, or another word are fraud shops. So places like Russian market. In the past, there was Genesis market. Really, these are places that you can usually pay a fee to register and get access to a database of logs that you can search, and you can identify targets of interest, i.e. credentials of interest. You might think of things like a Netflix account or access to an eBay shop and that kind of stuff. Really the where things are changing is they're looking more at, hey, can I get access to a single sign-on for an organization? Can I get access to their email? Can I get an authentication cookie to a Slack where I can social engineer my way in? These are capabilities that ransomware groups are using, and they're searching these shops for targets of interest from an extortion perspective, and then using that, again, buying these credentials for like $10 and using it as a way to get their foot in the door to run their attacks.
Wow, just getting easier and easier. Um, the other item I did want to touch on is Lockbit. So I know Lockbit has been identified as a significant threat, especially to SMBs. And in your opinion, what makes Lockbit and similar, ransomware as a service operations so challenging to defend against?
Yeah, I should start by saying recently there was law enforcement action against Lockbit. So uh, Lockbit is far and away over the last few years the biggest ransomware as a service group in terms of victim count. So it's really not a surprise that they were eventually disrupted by law enforcement. Those actions included taking over some of their leak sites. I believe they used a known vulnerability in PHP to get access and ultimately start to identify relationships between the Lockbit team and eventually disrupt their operations. That being said, unless you're putting these people in handcuffs, it's difficult to fully eradicate operations like these. There's just so much money to be made, and the skills are transferable, so they can take the knowledge that they have and just stand up a new operation, which is what they've likely already started to do. Now, when it comes to Lockbits, and to answer your question, Lockbit and ransomware service groups, they provide the opportunity for really any moderately skilled actor to run extortion attacks. So think of it like buying into a franchise. You're getting all the tools and all the expertise to get up and running, and a lot of the overhead is taken care of. So these groups will typically provide the encryption malware and handle negotiations and running the extortion website or the leak website for a cut of the payments. And as an actor, you also get access to a community of other actors who are experienced in this, as well as intrusion playbooks. And this is something we saw firsthand with the Conti group when their internal documents leaked. Really, all this means that ransomware actors are more agile and better prepared to leverage known TTPs. I want to sort of kind of underscore that known TTPs piece. Additionally, the best ideas in these groups are often copied or shared with other groups. For example, ransomware affiliates who work with one group, they can take all that group's methodology to another group who might have a more favorable profit sharing model for them, basically make them more money. And what this means for defenders is, we need to do all the things, patch holes quickly, and known vulnerabilities, etc. But we also need to understand and counter TTPs being used by adversaries. So, for example, to give you a recent example, a few ransomware groups have been observed using commercial remote access software. And as defenders, we can identify what this software is and proactively block and monitor for it across our enterprise.
So with Lockbit being a hot topic of conversation in the security industry, and knowing that eSentire has done a ton of research around that ransomware group as well, I'm curious, are you able to share your predictions or thoughts on what we might see with new ransomware groups spawning up, or branching out from past groups this year, 2024?
Yeah, I mean, if we think about how these groups operate, like they're providing a service, and affiliates or just any threat actor is uh, essentially subscribing to that service and conducting attacks and getting a cut of the ultimate extortion payment. Now that gives these groups and the whole I don't know if you want to call it industry, that's what gives it its agility, its efficiency, its ability to you know target a higher volume of victims. But that same uh, that same format also opens them up to infiltration by their adversaries, who would be, law enforcement or informants or people working with law enforcement. So that may not have been the case for Lockbit, because to my knowledge, they exploited a known vulnerability, but they may have used insider knowledge to figure out where that infrastructure was. There was another case, I believe it was with Alfie Black Cat, where law enforcement agencies used an informant to gain inside knowledge of those attacks. What does this mean for 2024 and beyond? I think we'll see ransomware groups certainly not go away. I think we'll see them try and change up how they operate to be more resilient to infiltration by their adversaries. How does that look, or what does that look like? Most likely, it will be, more. They'll be more choosy about who they work with, who their affiliates are, and probably more focus on profile victims. If you look at the Black Cat LV case, it was one of their better known affiliates that attacked MGM, and the sort of infiltration or the attention from law enforcement kind of followed that high profile event. So I think when we look at other groups and perhaps Lockbit, I think there'll be more focus on victims that aren't going to attract attention and possible disruption. Could also mean more, sort of smash and grab style attacks. And what that means is essentially less focus on data encryption, which might take a lot more effort, and more focus on data theft and just trying to be more agile in those, and hit more victims, low profile SMBs, steal their data and just throw those ransoms out. Ultimately, get a smaller payment, but more payments in the end. Well, probably kind of keeping that lower profile. We may see Lockbit rebrand. It's hard to say now, but end of the day, like I said, those skills and the methodologies are transferable to these new groups. We may also see kind of in that line something we talk about in the 2024 yearly threat report is some of these ransomware group veterans, if we want to call them that, stepping back from day-to-day operations and acting more as like a consulting or in a advisory role to other operators, and just sort of for a fee or a cut of their what they're making, advise them on how to run these types of businesses.
This is it's a good, I think a good way to finish our chat today is by getting your opinion on how organizations should respond to these types of threats. So what would you recommend?
Yeah, really, there's no secret sauce. There's no, specific thing that you can do to counter all ransomware, because the opportunity or the threat surface is so great. You really just need to do the basics, coupled with, in terms of preventative controls, coupled with some continuous monitoring capabilities. So, ensure you have phishing and security awareness program that covers both email and browser-based threats. So, if we look at the past year of data, we're actually seeing, when it comes to social engineering attacks, more and more malware coming through browser-based attacks, things like search advertisements or fake updates that users are encountering while they're browsing the web. And I believe there's a gap between security awareness programs that are much more focused on email threats versus the threats that are actually getting past their controls. Especially when it comes to browser-based threats. The other trend we're seeing is around edge device exploitation, which is kind of crazy to say in 2023, 2024, but we are seeing more edge appliances with known vulnerabilities being exploited and then used to deploy implants and ultimately deploy ransomware. So when it comes to those, apply those patches as quickly as possible, especially on those remotely facing systems, but also consider gaining visibility into those systems. In the case that there is a exploitation event, you want to be sure that you can find evidence of that and contain that intrusion. Another piece is remote access services. When we are oftentimes seeing or responding to ransomware attacks, they are using known compromised accounts through remote access services to gain access into the network, where they can start to run exploits, do scans, etc. Really important that you have phish resistant MFA on any remote access service for all accounts. And you also have, again, visibility into those authentication events so you can identify any anomalous activity there. The other side of this too is protecting your endpoints and having a, competent endpoint product that is, tuned to detect the TTPs that we're currently seeing. That's something we work on every day within the threat response unit, ensuring that as we identify gaps in our detection, either through an incident or by through external research, that we're addressing those with new detection and network blocks and that kind of stuff. The last thing I'll say here too is, obviously we talked a lot about the underground, or AKA the dark web. Having some visibility there, having that as part of your security stack is more and more important. Again, think of that stat from the Microsoft report about 80 to 90% of intrusions stemming from unmanaged systems. If you don't have that EDR running on that endpoint, how are you going to know if that system's been compromised? Think of it from the attacker's perspective. The way that if they compromise a system that's outside of your monitoring scope, good chance it's not domain joined, but it may have credentials of interest that they can use to gain access into your network. Oftentimes, they're going to sell those credentials on places like Russian market or other locations within the dark web. Having the visibility there can give you that opportunity to identify that and lock at those accounts and take action before somebody uses it against you.
All right. Lots of good information there. Thanks for sharing all that. Well, I think that is going to do it for our chat today, Spence. Thank you so much for taking your time to share your perspectives on the ransomware landscape with us. It was a pleasure.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you. Bye for now.